Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabella Maris. I am a professor of political science, and I will be moderating today's event with Professor Vernon Bogdanor. So today's event is the George Herbert Walker Lecture at Yale University, which is sponsored by the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. This lecture series was established in 1988 by Ambassador George Herbert Walker in honor of his father. And previous lectures have included Zbigniew Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, and others. So it is a great pleasure for us to be able to welcome today Professor Vernon Bogdanor, who's a professor of government at King's College London and has formerly taught at Oxford University. Professor Bogdanor is the author of many books, including The New British Constitution, published in 2009, Beyond Brexit, Towards a British Constitution, published in 2019, and of course, the Stimson Lectures, Britain and Europe in a Troubled World, which was published in 2020 and which many of us here in the audience have read. So Professor Bogdanor will talk for about 45 minutes, and after this, we will open up for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Isabella, for that very generous introduction, and I'm extremely honored to be following in the footsteps of the people you've mentioned. I suppose I ought to begin with two apologies. Firstly, a deep regret that I can't be at Yale, where I think a few things could be more enticing than New Haven in the spring. And secondly, I feel I have to apologize for my cluttered and messy room. But I do take comfort from something that Einstein once said. He said, a cluttered room is supposed to represent a cluttered mind. But if that is right, what does an empty room symbolize? This lecture, as you said, Isabella, is in honor of George Herbert Walker Jr., who was, as I understand it, a Yale alumnus and uncle of George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States. And I gather he was a member of the Skull and Bones Club in Yale, as Henry Stimson was. And it was under his name that I gave the lectures in 2019, as you said, now been published in this beautiful book by Yale University Press, Britain and Europe in a Troubled World. Stimson called his election to Skull and Bones the most important educational experience of his life. And I think that casts some aspersion on the quality of the academic education then available at Yale, if being elected to Skull and Bones was the most important. I don't know whether it still exists. Now, I want to carry on these Stimson lectures further forward. When I gave the lectures, Britain was still a member of the European Union, and some believed, some hoped she might remain so. But in fact, Britain left on the 31st of January 2020, and the transition period ended on the 31st of December 2020. So Britain is now outside the European Union. And this departure was provided for in two legal instruments. The first was the withdrawal agreement agreed after Boris Johnson's election victory in December 2019. And this agreement included an important and highly controversial Northern Ireland Protocol, which I will discuss later. The second legal instrument, which provided for Britain's future relationship with the EU, was the Trade and Cooperation Agreement agreed on Christmas Eve in 2020. Now, all this may seem a final settlement, but in fact, it is not. It is more the skeleton or outline of a settlement than it is something final. It is incomplete, and some matters are left for future negotiation. For example, much about financial services is left for future negotiation, professional qualifications, and perhaps most important of all in the modern world, non-tariff barriers to trade. And much will be negotiated through a joint partnership council, which the agreement establishes, and by other intergovernmental bodies. Now, the agreement is also subject to review in 5 years and can be terminated by either party with 12 months' notice. And this is by contrast with the withdrawal agreement, which cannot be terminated, with the exception of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which can. And some have said the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is merely a prelude to a perpetual renegotiation. If you'll forgive me for just a second, I think I'll switch the light on, which will make things a bit clearer. Now, the agreement is a success in the sense that each side seems to have secured what it wanted. The EU has preserved its internal market, while Britain has regained her legal sovereignty and a degree of autonomy. Britain now controls her laws, her borders, and her trading relationships. And British negotiators faced the issue of whether to go for access or autonomy. The greater the access to the EU, the more Britain would have to follow EU rules, and so the less autonomy, the less taking back of control, to use the slogan of the Brexiteers in the 2016 referendum. The more taking back of control there is, the less access there is to EU markets. Now, the Theresa May government, which preceded the Boris Johnson government, gave greater weight to access, Boris Johnson greater weight to autonomy. So some say the trade and cooperation agreement does not give Britain sufficient autonomy, and that Britain could have the worst of both worlds, insufficient access and insufficient autonomy. Time will tell. But the nature of the agreement, as I've said, is the relationship is not set in stone, and it's possible that a future government of the left might seek a less divergent relationship by, for example, rejoining the EU customs union or the single market, whereas a more Eurosceptic government could move Britain further away from the EU. And all this shows that Brexit is a process and not an event, and that although masked at present by COVID, Brexit, which has so convulsed British politics, still has the potential to destabilise the political system here. Now, the trade and cooperation agreement provided that Britain's future relationship would be one of tariff-free trade. Now, as you know, the European Union is based on three principles. The first is free trade. The second is a customs union, so there's a common tariff against all third countries. The third is an internal market, in theory free of regulations, so that it is easy to export goods and services from Paris to, for example, Berlin or Rome, as it is from Paris to Bordeaux in France. In other words, it removes frontiers in Europe, as of course is the case in America between the states of America. You can export goods from California to New York State as easily as from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Now, as I've said, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement provides for Britain to accept the first of these three principles, free trade, but not the other two. So we remain outside the customs union and outside the EU regulatory area, with the exception of Northern Ireland, about which I will talk later. So it provides for free trade, the agreement, but not for frictionless trade. Now, my main theme today is the constitutional consequences of Brexit, first for Britain and then for the European Union. But I begin with Britain, and I want to discuss in relation to Britain two questions. First, the consequences for human rights, and second, for the devolution settlement, and particularly for Scotland and Northern Ireland. But I want to make one preliminary point first. Contrary to what many suggest, Brexit has not led to an inward-looking nationalistic Britain, much less a racist, insular and nativist Britain, as is sometimes suggested, and dare I say it, for example, even in the New York Times. And one remarkable consequence of Brexit, unforeseen by me certainly, I was not a Brexiteer, I ought to emphasise, one unforeseen consequence is that it has liberated Britain's liberal political culture. Now, immigration had a very high salience during the period of the Brexit referendum, and the EU principle of free movement was perhaps the main reason why many voted for Brexit. But since Brexit, far from there having been an anti-immigrant backlash, attitudes towards immigration have softened. Immigration has lost its high salience, and there is now a much more positive attitude towards it. It appears the British public are not against immigration per se, but against uncontrolled immigration. They want immigration managed, but not ended. In 2019, an Ipsos Mori poll of 27 countries asked the question, has immigration had a generally positive impact? The figure in Britain was 48%, and that was higher than in the other 27 countries of the European Union. The Migration Observatory in Britain in 2020 asked, or put the statement, few or no immigrants of a different race should be allowed to enter the country. In Britain, 26% agreed with that. That was the lowest in the European Union, except for Sweden. And Britain alone, amongst the major countries of the European Union, has no populist or racist party represented in the House of Commons, whereas Germany has the Alternative for Deutschland, which is the official opposition, France, the Front National, which is the main challenger to President Macron, almost certainly, in the presidential elections next year. Italy's Lega has been in power for much of the last 4 years. In Sweden, the Sweden Democrats have denied the government a majority for some time, let alone Mr. Orban in Hungary and Mr. Kaczynski in Poland. And so the British position is that Brexit has not been associated with a rise in populism or illiberalism. And I wonder if it's possible to argue that Brexit has proved a means by which Britain has avoided populism, and to ask the further question of whether there are trends in the very development of the EU that are leading to populism. Now, I'm not going to answer the first question and say no more about it, but I will the second at the end of my talk. But I now want to talk about the constitutional consequences of Brexit. Now, if there's one thing everyone knows about Britain is that we have no constitution. They sometimes say no written constitution. They mean no codified constitution, because our rules about government are not passed on by word of mouth. They are in writing, but they're not codified in one document. But while we were members of the EU, that is from 1973 to early 2020, just over 46 years, that proposition was not true. We were living under a constitution, the constitution of the European Union treaties, which bound both Parliament and people in Britain. The European Union is a protected system, its institutions enjoying only the powers given to them by the treaties. And this constitutional system bears some resemblance to that of the American. It's based on a separation of powers between institutions at the centre, notably the Council of Ministers, the Commission, the Parliament and the European Court of Justice, as well as territorially between the EU and the national member states. Moreover, it is a constitutional system based on the judicial review of primary legislation, because the European Court of Justice, as well as national courts, can disapply or annul legislation incompatible with any aspect of EU law. And that was strengthened in December 2009, when the EU adopted a Charter of Fundamental Rights. So the constitutional system of the EU is, by contrast with the traditional British one, protected against the abuse of legislative power. Now, much was said in Britain about the transfer, the shift of power from Westminster to Brussels, which membership of the EU entailed. Much less was said about another profound shift of power from Parliament and indeed the executive to the courts. Because before British entry, the European Court of Justice had developed two fundamental doctrines essential to the maintenance of an economic community: the doctrine of direct effect and the doctrine of the supremacy of community law, or union law as it now is. And according to these doctrines, the legislatures of the member states, in acceding to the European communities, had agreed to restrict their legislative competence in areas where the EU acted. In consequence, community law created rights for individuals which national courts and tribunals were under a duty to enforce. And in the event of a conflict between community law and the law of a member state, community law would prevail. And in virtue of a case in 1978, the Simmental case, it became the duty of every national court and tribunal to enforce community law and to disapply any conflicting national law. So the logical implication was that a litigant could go to a domestic court in Britain to have a statutory provision enacted in Westminster set aside, and British judges were under a duty to apply community legislation and to interpret Westminster legislation where that was possible, so that it was in conformity with community law. Now, in the landmark case, which I'm sure many are familiar with, the Factortame case in 1999, the British courts, for the first time in their history, disapplied part of a Westminster statute, the Merchant Shipping Act of 1988, as being in conflict with community law. So in relation to the European Union, British courts took on a new role. They became, in effect, constitutional courts, like the American Supreme Court, if you like. So it followed, as long as we remained in the European Union, Westminster was in effect a legislature of limited competence. So Europe altered the balance of power in British government in favour of the judiciary at the expense of Parliament and government. There's a shift of power, not just from Parliament to the European Court of Justice, but also to national courts. Now that, of course, was the case in all of the member states, but was of particular importance for Britain because of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. We had no history of the judicial review of primary legislation. So the effect of European community membership was to entrench provisions of community law into our legal system. Now this was all strengthened by the adoption by the European Union of a Charter of Fundamental Rights, adopted in 2000, but it did not come into force till December 2009. And this has 54 articles containing a vast and wide range of rights. Most important, perhaps, is a very wide Article 21 right to non-discrimination on grounds such as sex, race, colour, ethnic or social origin, genetic features, language, religion or belief, political or any other opinion, membership of a national minority, property, birth, disability, age or sexual orientation. And this, of course, provides explicit protection for members of the LGBT community. This charter only applies when member states are implementing EU law, and it is a part of EU law. And I think this means the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg can be compared in some ways to the American Supreme Court in terms of the breadth of its powers. And again, the national courts of the member states are required to supply primary legislation and quash secondary legislation if they find it to be incompatible with a charter provision that is directly effective. Now, we did not incorporate that charter into our domestic law, and we thought we had an opt-out from it. But in fact, we did not have such an opt-out, and it would have appeared odd, perhaps, if it were possible to opt out from something so fundamental. It would be as if, for example, Texas could opt out from the American Bill of Rights. And the Charter has been used by British judges for the first time again in British history to disapply parts of a Westminster statute because they are in conflict with human rights. And there's a landmark case in 2017, which ought to be as well known as Factortame, but I fear isn't, the case of Benkhar-Bouch versus Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Now, Ms. Benkhar-Bouch claimed against the Sudanese embassy for unfair dismissal, failure to pay her the national minimum wage and holiday pay, and breaches of the working time regulations. And the Sudanese embassy claimed immunity under the provisions of the 1978 State Immunity Act. But the British Supreme Court ruled that sections of this act were incompatible with Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights, providing for a fair trial. Now, that itself gave no legal remedy, but Article 47 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights provides that anyone whose rights have been violated does have the right to an effective remedy. The Supreme Court said if the Convention has been violated, so also has the Charter, and therefore the relevant parts of this British Act of Parliament must be disapplied. So this Charter provided strong protection for human rights in Britain. But you may not be surprised to hear it is not to be incorporated into British law as retained law after Brexit, so it will no longer apply domestically. The government has promised that these rights will continue to be respected, and it's presented a list of rights in the Charter to show they're being secured in domestic law. But a list of rights is not a substitute for a codification of rights protected by the judicial review of primary legislation. Even more important, the legal remedy provided by the Charter is lost. So the courts will no longer be able to strike down or disapply legislation or parts of legislation as being in conflict with these rights. And in addition, the rights in the Charter are at the mercy of any future government or parliament, which can at any stage amend or delete them, so they're no longer protected rights. You may ask, what value does a right have if it is dependent upon the whim of a sovereign parliament and no legal remedy for breach? As the former chair of the Bar Council said in 2017, rights are not being brought home, they are being abolished. Britain is doing something that I think has not occurred before in recorded history. It's moving from a codified and protected constitutional system to an uncodified and unprotected one based on the sovereignty of Parliament. rights are now entirely dependent upon Parliament, whose sovereignty is being restored. And that trend, of course, goes against that in many other democracies where rights protection is being enlarged rather than abolished. Now, it's rare, again, if not unprecedented, for a democracy to exit from a major human rights regime. And as I say, no country has hitherto moved from a protected to an unprotected system. And this process, therefore, raises profound constitutional questions. No democracy other than Britain, except for New Zealand, has a sovereign parliament. But New Zealand is hardly comparable. It's a small country of just over 4.25 million people, just over half the population of Greater London, and a relatively homogeneous country. It's an exception among the world's democracies. And I want to end this section by asking the question of my audience. The question is this: are British MPs so uniquely sensitive to the protection of human rights as compared with legislators in other countries, other democracies, that they should be entrusted with this important task? I leave it to you to answer this question. Now, the second constitutional consequence of Brexit is in relation to devolution. And as you know, the United Kingdom is a country comprising 4 territories: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. In 1998, it was explicitly acknowledged that the United Kingdom is a multinational state, because in that year, legislation providing for devolution in the non-English parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, was enacted. Devolution was an acknowledgement that there are separate political wills in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. England is the largest part of the United Kingdom with 85% of the population, but has no parliament of her own. But ministers for matters such as education and health are now in practice ministers for England only, because education and health are examples of matters which have been devolved to the non-English parts of the kingdom. Now, Euroscepticism has been much stronger in England than in Scotland or Northern Ireland. Both the English and Scots have felt their identity under attack, but they react in different ways. England feels her identity under attack from the European Union, Scotland from English dominance. So the English answer was Brexit. The Scottish nationalist answer is independence within the European Union. In Scotland, the European Union is widely regarded as an enabler of independence, and by nationalists in Northern Ireland as an enabler of Irish unity. In England, Europe was seen as a threat. Now, since the Scots have for long had to share power with England, they did not find it difficult that power could also be shared with the European Union. But the English sense of identity, by contrast, is Hobbesian, something that is difficult to share with anyone. In England, the notion that the sovereignty of Parliament is a guarantor of liberty has been felt more strongly than in other parts of the United Kingdom. So England found herself less sympathetic to the European project, whose leitmotif is the transcending of sovereignty. Now, the United Kingdom is often mistakenly characterized as being composed of 4 nations, and some critics of devolution spoke of it as 4 nations and a funeral for the United Kingdom. But Northern Ireland, unlike England, Wales, and Scotland, is not a nation. It came into existence almost 100 years ago in May 1921. And its position is, dare I say it, sometimes misunderstood in the United States. In 1921, 26 counties in Ireland with Catholic and nationalist majorities decided to exercise their right of self-determination by separating from Britain to form what is now the Irish Republic. But 6 counties in the north, with largely Protestant and Unionist majorities, exercised their right of self-determination by deciding that they wanted to remain in the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland, although part of the island of Ireland, remains part of the United Kingdom. Now, there is, of course, in Northern Ireland, a large nationalist and Catholic minority, which could at some stage become a majority. And many in that minority would wish to join the Irish Republic. But neither of the 2 communities in Northern Ireland believes that Northern Ireland is a nation. The Unionist majority sees itself as belonging to the British nation, and a Unionist, by definition, cannot regard herself as belonging to a Northern Irish nation. It's a union with Britain. Nationalists see themselves as belonging to the Irish nation. Now, politics in Northern Ireland is often seen, certainly by people in Britain, perhaps by people in America as well, as being somewhat un-British. And paradoxically, that's because the principal political division in the province is about whether it should remain British, that is part of the United Kingdom. And politics in Northern Ireland is quite different from politics in Scotland, Wales, or indeed any other part of the United Kingdom, since the main issue is whether or not it should remain part of the United Kingdom or join with the Irish Republic. Politics there is primarily about identity. Now, since the Unionists seem to enjoy a permanent majority, you cannot have an alternation of power such as is normally achieved in a democratic system. So the Westminster model cannot work in the province as it would in Scotland and Wales. So devolution in Northern Ireland has been constructed on a quite different basis. It was re-established in Northern Ireland in 1998 as part of the provisions of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, which is an agreement between the British and Irish governments, as well as the main political parties in Northern Ireland. The agreement was endorsed by a treaty signed by the British and Irish governments and also by massive majorities in parallel referendums in Northern Ireland and Ireland. And this act required the executive in Northern Ireland to be on a cross-community basis, with legislation based on the principle of power sharing between the two communities. The executive must be a coalition, with the First Minister representing the majority and the Deputy First Minister the minority. And under this system, the First Minister is not the leader of the executive, but shares that, a co-equal with the deputy, and a cabinet is chosen by the two of them in proportion to representation in the Assembly. Now, the 2016 Brexit referendum provided stark evidence of the existence of separate wills in the four parts of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom as a whole, as you know, voted to leave the European Union. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. The United Kingdom vote for Brexit was around 52 to 48%, and in England and Wales it was about 53 to 47% to stay. Scotland voted to remain by 62% to 38%, and Northern Ireland voted to remain by 56% to 44%. And the Brexit vote was determined by voters in England and Wales, and Scotland and Northern Ireland were to be extruded, as they saw it, from the European Union against their wishes. So Brexit could pose severe strains on the unity of the kingdom and actually threaten its cohesion. Now, the Brexit referendum, of course, gave encouragement to Scottish nationalists. It came shortly after a referendum on independence in 2014, which the nationalists lost by 55% to 45%. But one of the arguments used by the Unionists was that only by voting to reject independence could the Scots be sure to retain their membership of the European Union. But having duly rejected independence, the Scots nevertheless were to lose their membership of the European Union against their wishes. Therefore, so nationalists argued, the Scots had been induced to support the Union under false pretences, and the SNP is now calling for a second referendum on independence to preserve Scottish membership of the European Union. Now, in the past, the Scottish nationalists faced the problem of a cross-cutting cleavage because 1/3 of their supporters, in fact, voted to leave. But since the Brexit referendum of 2016 would be a realignment, the Brexiteers have left the SNP for other parties, but that's been compensated for by Remainers who joined the SNP from other parties. So that cross-cutting cleavage is no longer there, and the SNP is foursquare on staying within the European Union. Now, if the Scottish Parliament elections are due next month, and it's very possible, indeed I would say likely, the SNP will win a majority, they would then call for another referendum. The government in Scotland will almost certainly refuse it. Sorry, the government in London, Westminster, will almost certainly refuse it. Nationalists would claim the union now rests not on consent, but on force. And the implication is the union is a voluntary union of nations. But Article 1 of the 1707 Treaty provides that England and Scotland will be merged forever after, as quote. What can forever after mean in a system with a sovereign parliament? The union with Ireland used similar wording, but was in large part abrogated when the 26 counties seceded in 1921, and the government would have abrogated it in relation to Scotland had the independence referendum of 2014 yielded a different result. Is the United Kingdom a voluntary union of nations? Many modern democracies either restrict secession constitutionally, as Spain does, or as in America, forbid it altogether. The United States, whatever else it is not a voluntary union of states. Now, Northern Ireland was also favourable to British membership, and the Brexit referendum there seemed to encourage the nationalists to gain, because since the Irish Republic is an enthusiastic member of the EU, there's a large majority on the island of Ireland for remaining. And Northern Ireland is unique in the United Kingdom, the only part of it that could rejoin the European Union without having to renegotiate it, because it would not be forming a new state as Scotland would be if it seceded. Instead, it'd be joining an existing member state, the Irish Republic, which is in the European Union, just as East Germany joined the European Union when it linked with West Germany in 1989 after the fall of communism. Now, the Brexit campaign in Northern Ireland was quite different from that in the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, the issues were control of immigration and control of British legislation for the EU. These issues played little part in Northern Ireland. The key issue there was the community conflict between Unionists and Nationalists. It was another battleground. The main nationalist party, Sinn Féin, favoured Remain. The main Unionist party, Democratic Unionist Party, favoured Leave. And around 88% of self-defined nationalists voted to Remain. Around 66% of self-defined Unionists voted to Leave. So the referendum intensified the community division. One commentator after the referendum, for the first time in my life, the prospect of a united Ireland is not only credible but inevitable. I think that goes a bit far. But those who identified as British could say this was a UK decision. Those who identify as Irish say the majority in Ireland wants to remain in the European Union. But of course, 34% of self-defined Unionists voted Remain. They weren't voting for union with the Republic. Now, the position of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom is conditional explicitly on consent. That was in the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement of 1998. If at any time it appears to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland that the majority wants to join the Republic, there will be a referendum, and also a referendum in the Republic. Now, Brexit, of course, re-establishes a border between the Republic and Northern Ireland. This is the only land border between Britain and the EU. But the EU and the Irish Republic both believed the land border should not also be a customs border. They said this would increase the danger of terrorism, since it would seem to block the aspiration of nationalists for Irish unity. So the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is part of the withdrawal agreement, provides for Northern Ireland to remain within the EU internal market for goods. The rest of Britain is out of the internal market. Northern Ireland remains within it. So there's a regulatory border in the Irish Sea. Now, also, the protocol says that Northern Ireland leaves the customs union with the rest of the United Kingdom. But Article 5 of the protocol declares in seeming contradiction that EU customs legislation will continue to apply to Northern Ireland. So in practice, Northern Ireland is required to abide by EU customs rules. So it's in a different customs and regulatory regime in terms of trade in goods from the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, some say from the economic point of view, this gives Northern Ireland a huge advantage because it will have the commercial advantages of being in both the UK and the EU single market. The economic effect may well be to push Northern Ireland closer to the Republic. But Unionists in Northern Ireland say this breaches the 1800 Act of Union, which provides for Northern Ireland to enjoy the same privileges and encouragements in trade as the rest of the UK. And it means that goods travelling from the rest of Britain to Northern Ireland face customs formalities and checks in the Irish Sea, tariffs and customs and so on, which almost certainly raises costs and prices. But sending parcels from one part of the United Kingdom to another could become akin to an international transaction. Imagine Americans' feelings if sending goods and parcels from Connecticut to Texas involved checks on the goods coming in. And Northern Ireland is required to accept EU regulatory rules, around 300 EU directives and protocols, without a vote on what they are, which is regulation without representation. It could be changed with the EU, and Northern Ireland has no representation there. And objections to the protocol have caused massive protests already, some violent in Northern Ireland, by Unionists who say that as British taxpayers, they are deprived of their position of equal citizenship without their consent. So parallel to the threat of IRA terrorism, if there's a hard border on the island of Ireland, is a threat of unionist terrorism if there's a hard border between different parts of the United Kingdom. So in Northern Ireland, as in Scotland, Brexit has resurrected the issue of sovereignty, an existential matter. It has replaced the conciliation of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement with the either or of Brexit, because wherever you put the border, it is destabilizing. Now, when Britain entered the European community, as it then was in 1973, the future of the United Kingdom seemed assured. Now it is a question mark. It's worth pointing out the borders of the country in its current form date only from 1922, when Irish independence was recognised, 100 years old. Now, earlier I said that while Britain was in the EU, we lived under a constitution. Now I want to say Brexit has revealed that we live under 4 different constitutions, depending on whether you look at it from London, from Scotland, from Wales, or from Northern Ireland. If you look at the constitution from Northern Ireland, Irish nationalists believe the system of power sharing in the Good Friday Agreement, together with provisions in it for North-South cooperation and a consultative role for the government of the Republic, amounts to a convention by which the British government is required not to make constitutional changes, such as were involved in Brexit, without the agreement of both communities in Northern Ireland, and also the government of the Republic. And they say that the agreement had yielded a system of shared sovereignty in Ireland. British government stands by the legal position that the Good Friday Agreement does not provide for joint authority or joint sovereignty, but preserves the sovereignty of Westminster. The Unionists take a different view entirely. They say their agreement to the sovereignty of Parliament is contractual rather than unconditional, conditional upon Westminster not taking measures to undermine the Union. So Unionists believe they can use what the rest of the United Kingdom would regard as unconstitutional methods, including the threat of civil disobedience, to defeat measures which threaten the Union. So from both the Unionist as well as the nationalist perspective in Northern Ireland, the view of the Constitution is different from what it is in Westminster. The view from Scotland is also very different, because the Scottish people believe that their constitution is based not on the sovereignty of Parliament, and that devolution was not a delegation from Westminster, but a recognition of the sovereign will of the Scottish people. And the claim of right of 1689, repeated in 1989, says that we gathered together do hereby acknowledge the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government suited to their needs. So the sovereign right of the Scottish people is a conflicting constitutional principle to the sovereignty of Parliament, and does imply that the Union is a voluntary one. The Welsh take a different view. They say that the logic of devolution implies evolution towards a quasi-federal state in which the rights of the various parts are protected, and they want this done through a constitutional convention by which the British government has to secure the consent of at least one of the devolved bodies for policies affecting the distribution of power, the territorial distribution of power. The Welsh seek a new constitutional settlement for the United Kingdom in which Parliament would explicitly abandon its claims of sovereignty. I believe there's an American saying to the effect that in politics, where you stand depends upon where you sit. And this may also be said of the British Constitution following devolution and Brexit. The meaning of the British Constitution depends on whether you look at it from London, from Belfast, from Edinburgh, or Cardiff. Now, there is no agreed and shared understanding anymore what the Constitution is. That can't be good for the cohesion and unity of the state. And to refashion a new form of union, a single constitution which all 4 territories can accept, is a task which now faces a post-Brexit government. It will not be easy. The last issue I want to consider is whether Brexit was an aberration or whether it reveals real weaknesses in the European Union. It was an aberration to this extent. It won't be followed by any other country in the European Union, because for many of them, the European Union symbolizes the emergence from dictatorship, acceptance of the democracy. But it is a point to real weaknesses in the structure of the European Union. This is an old theme, which I wrote about many years ago in 1992, in a book entitled Elitism, Populism and European Politics, edited by the late Jack Hayward, a book which contained the papers of a conference organised by the Institute of European Studies at Oxford. And in that book, I contrasted the large majorities for the Maastricht Treaty in the legislatures of the member states of the EU with the scepticism revealed in various opinion polls. I said there was a democratic deficit in the European Union which its leaders should confront. They have not done so. Perhaps they did not read my chapter. How should the EU respond? My answer today builds on points I made in the final chapter of my book of the Stimson Lectures. The central problem for the EU is that it has been unable to represent the people of Europe effectively. It needs to transform itself from a technocratic organisation into a political one. The essence of a political organisation is that it represents effectively. The idea of representation implies that decisions are made by a majority and minorities accept them, hoping no doubt to become the majority at the next election. Effective representation presupposes that those represented feel they belong to a single community. It is this which makes majority rule acceptable. So it implies some degree of homogeneity and unity amongst the electorate. There must be a single electorate so that its government can speak for all. As Hobbes says in Leviathan, a multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented. Now, some minorities do not accept this. Sinn Féin didn't 100 years ago. They said we're not a minority in Britain, but a majority in Ireland, and so we won't come to Westminster at all. We'll set up our own parliament in Dublin. Sinn Féin takes the same view today. Their MPs do not come to Westminster. Scottish nationalists take the same view, though they do come to Westminster, but they say we're not a minority in Britain, we're part of the Scottish majority. Perhaps Britain did not feel part of a unified community in the European Union. Perhaps they were in the same position. But in addition to a homogeneous community, you also need for effective representation an effective party system. Disraeli said you cannot have parliamentary government without party government. There must be parties broadly united on matters of public policy so the executive can be responsible to the representative legislature. It's the party which secures a broad correspondence between the views of government and those of the electorate in a parliamentary system. And clearly a parliament of 650 independent MPs could not do that. Now, can these ideas of representation be made effective in the European Union? There are two answers, two ways of doing it. The first, by analogy with the American system, a separation of powers system, where you have a unifying element in the direct election of the president, similarly perhaps in France. Now that, of course, does require also a unified and homogeneous community. And of course, America had a problem in this regard, since after the presidential election of 1860, the southern states declared they were not a minority in America, but a majority of their own in a new Confederate state. The great British liberal statesman Gladstone said the South had created a nation. Perhaps on grounds of self-determination he was right, but the North had superior force, and it was then reaffirmed that the United States was an indissoluble federal union. The second method of securing accountability is through the parliamentary method, through a European Parliament elected by universal suffrage and a broadly common electoral system. But what is the EU executive which is to be responsible to the European Parliament? What is the common government? Is it the Commission? If it is, it has to become a partisan body, a body of left or right. So if the European Parliament did not like it, it could replace it with another more to its liking. And in theory, no doubt, the transnational political parties could yield left or right coalitions, which would make that sort of accountability feasible. But of course, the Commission would then not be what it was meant to be, a neutral body over and above the member states, a body dedicated to a common European good, which was its original conception. But is Europe, does it have the fairly homogeneous and unified electorate that means it had become a community? Perhaps it existed when it was formed in 1958 with 6 founder members, or perhaps if there was an inner core of just a few member states prepared to move rapidly to political integration, as President Macron wants. But it's far from that now. And all sorts of measures have been produced with the purpose of helping to make Europe a political community. the customs union, or Zollverein, which helped make Germany a political community in the 19th century, direct elections to European Parliament, the creation of transnational political parties, creation of the single market, creation of the single currency, co-decision of the European Parliament with the Council, the Spitzen candidate idea for choosing the President of the Commission, and now banking and fiscal union, but none of them have succeeded in achieving a homogeneous and unified EU community. All were thought to be game changers, but none of them have in fact been. The main divisions in the EU remain those between member states, for example, on burden sharing between the Hanseatic states and others, and on the issue of the rule of law between East and West. There's no sense of common and unified allegiance needed for a system of parliamentary accountability to work. The transformation from a technocratic into a political system, other than a confederal system, cannot be achieved, I suspect, by institutional reforms at all, but only by a slow transformation in the culture of the European electorate into a more homogeneous whole, and that is likely to prove a long process. And indeed, some federal states, such as the United States, Germany, and Switzerland, only achieved it through war, but that, of course, is not an option available to the European Union. The European Parliament does not have the same relationship to the people of Europe that domestic legislators have to their peoples. Most Europeans continue to give their primary allegiance to legislators of their member state, not the European Parliament, whose elections attract a much smaller turnout and which appears far more remote. And of course, the real decision-making body of the EU is not the Commission, but the Council, comprising the governments of the member states, which cannot be responsible to the European Parliament, nor is it accountable except indirectly to the voters. It would, in theory, no doubt be possible for each of the 27 states to remove their governments and replace them with 27 alternative governments committed to a different set of European policies, but that is implausible. So the European Parliament cannot replace one executive with another or one set of policies with another, nor can European voters. So European peoples cannot say, we do not like what Europe has done, we want an alternative policy. The Council remains outside the area of political challenge. And the more powers that the European Union acquires, the more it entrenches upon national competencies, the greater the danger of this democratic deficit, and the more likely it is that populist parties will fill that vacuum. So there's a clear contrast between the EU and a federal state, because with a federal state, integration involves a transfer of power to a directly elected body or bodies, such as the US presidency and Congress, federal governments in Australia, Canada, and Germany. In Europe, it's to an indirectly elected council of ministers. And the more integration there is, the more Europe entrenches on national competencies, the greater its isolation from the people. A European people does not exist. Let me repeat what Hobbes says. A multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented. There is not such a person in Europe. And so it's populist parties that have resurrected the question, who represents the people, the European Parliament or national parliaments? The answer, I fear, is obvious. And the more targets there will be for populist parties, the more common policies the EU develops. When ministers have to say to their national legislators, I'm sorry you do not like this policy, there is nothing I can do about it, and nothing you can do about it, nothing the voters can do about it either. And even if the voters were to change their government, it will make no difference, because the limits of accountability are also limits on the ability of voters to alter policies of which they may disapprove. So my conclusion, and I'm sorry to have gone on longer than I should have done, even as it is, I have oversimplified and summarized. My conclusion is Europe can only be unified either on a basis of concentric circles with a small group of countries going together in integration, which is what President Macron wants, or alternatively on a confederal basis. And on either of those bases, it might just be possible for Britain to regain an honoured place in Europe. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. I'm now open to questions. I can't hear. You're muted.
Yes, I apologize. Thank you very much for this lecture, Professor Bogdanor. We have now we are opening the question and answer period, and I know several of the students have also prepared questions, and I'm encouraging them to place them in the Q&A section on Zoom, because I cannot see you, and so this is my only way to interact with you and see your questions. So we have Annie Fang first, Stephen Wilkinson, and Noah Kopf, and please add questions to the Q&A. So Annie, go ahead. Christina, can you help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want me to? I can speak out the question.
So they cannot ask. Okay, so go ahead.
No, I can allow her to talk.
Yes, please. Okay, Annie, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much, Professor, for speaking with us today. My question is about sort of this question of what does it mean to be British? I think it's a question that comes up very frequently on this issue of Brexit. So what do you think are the most important historical or political aspects of the British identity that make it so difficult to be reconciled with a European identity?
Right. This is a question which has exercised a lot of people. And when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister between 2010, he tried to get an answer to this question. And there was a lot of talk about British values, but they tend to be no different from American values or Irish values or French values or German values, rather general and cliche-ridden freedom, equality, whatever you like. And we don't think in that way. The Americans do, as I understand it. To be American is to pledge allegiance to the Constitution. And as I understand it, immigrants to America have to pledge allegiance to the Constitution. And we recently introduced something which I think is pretty awful, a citizenship test for new immigrants. You have to show how you, whether you know something about the United Kingdom. Now, in my view, the British do not like these sort of ideological statements, and they don't like pledges of allegiance or anything of that sort. And the answer that most people in Britain would give to your question is a very simple one. To be British is to wish to be represented in the House of Commons. And this distinguishes, shall we say, in Scotland, the unionist parties from the nationalist parties who are represented but don't wish to be. They want to be represented in their own Scottish Parliament, and also Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. And Parliament has such centrality in British life, the sovereignty of Parliament. And that's the reason why we found Europe difficult, because by contrast with many of the other European countries, we have a long, because we're an island perhaps, a long evolutionary history. The last change in our history, last break, was in 1660 when the monarchy was restored. We called that significantly the Restoration after the Civil War, when we were a republic for 11 years. And the principle of the sovereignty of Parliament reflects that long evolutionary history. It also explains why we don't have a constitution. There's no point having one if Parliament is sovereign. Now, of course, as I said, in Europe, you do have a constitution, so we did then have one. But we don't like metaphysical or philosophical statements about identity in Britain. We tend to get on with things pragmatically and practically. And I think the answer to your question really is, to be British is to be happy to be represented in the House of Commons at Westminster.
Thank you so much. I will read Stephen Wilkinson's question next. If the SNP win a majority, do you expect the current disunity within the Scottish nationalists to prevent them from successfully pushing for a new referendum? Or will London's opposition to a second referendum help to unify the nationalists?
This is two parts, really. No, I don't think the opposition, the new party, is unlikely to get many votes. The so-called Alba party, led by Alex Salmon, the former leader, it's not likely to get many votes. And if it wins any seats, it'll only be on the list part of that is the proportional representation part of the election. And I don't think in practice it will dissipate the energies of the Scottish nationalists. It won't affect Westminster's attitude. The current attitude of the government is there shouldn't be another referendum. It may be that will be altered. And Boris Johnson has said different things at different times. And he's not averse to changing his mind, which perhaps is needed in democratic government. It's a very difficult question, and it does raise the question that I discussed of whether the union is a purely voluntary union, which, as I said, the United States is not. The United States is not a voluntary union. I think the Confederate Constitution, I stand open to correction, I think the Confederate Constitution, which the seceding states set up, was a voluntary union, that I think any state could secede from the Confederacy, but I'm open to correction on that. But anyway, the United States clearly not a voluntary union. There's a big question whether Britain constitutionally is or not. It's a very difficult question, which we may face practically after the election, but I don't think the split in the Scottish nationalists should be taken too seriously. Stephen Wilkinson, I think, is of Scottish origin, which explains partly his question, I think. I don't know whether he's a unionist or a nationalist, but I think he is of Scottish origin.
Thank you so much. Noah, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, please?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thank you for being here, Professor. So my question for you is that whether in the Brexit negotiations, did you see any evidence that EU negotiators were kind of considering how to deter other countries from leaving the EU? Like, did you see them press for a tougher deal, for example, in order to deter other countries that might pursue the path that Britain went down?
Perhaps most strongly in the case of Northern Ireland, though perhaps other countries don't face any equivalent, that I think that was slightly hostile to British interests, saying that the price of leaving is to, in part, divide your country in two. But no, I think the EU stuck to its principles, which were to maintain the internal market, and that if you want access, you have to accept certain obligations. There were some people in Britain who believed we could have the benefits without accepting the obligations, and the EU, for understandable reasons, was determined to say you couldn't. And as I say, it was a question of judgment for the British government to consider whether it wanted closer access, which would mean less freedom to chart its own path, or whether it wanted a greater divergence. I should add that one of the motivations of the Brexiteers has been undermined by COVID, because one of the hopes of some of them, free market conservatives, was that Britain could become a kind of global Australia or New Zealand. Some said Singapore, but Australia, New Zealand more of a model, that it be a global free trading country, lowering tariffs, subsidies, and deregulating, Thatcherite model, if you like. Now, that probably was never possible, but COVID has made it almost certainly impossible, because COVID has led, in the British government, as probably governments elsewhere, to a much greater degree of state intervention and regulation. So that kind of free market model, I think neoliberalism is probably one of the ideologies which has suffered from COVID, and that has damaged one of the possibilities of the Brexiteers. But no, I think on the whole, the EU stuck to its guns, as was expected, except arguably on Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. Mitchell, go ahead. Can you ask your question, please? And unmute yourself.
Thanks so much for being here. So I have two questions. The first is a bit long, so bear with me, sorry. So in chapter 3 of your book, Britain and Europe in a Troubled World, titled Brexit Means Brexit, Britain Out of Europe, you seem to make the case, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, that there are 3 different motivations on the side of the largely working class Leave voters. You outlined the cultural challenges posed to working class folks who felt their communities were being changed without their consent due to large-scale EU immigration from Eastern Europe. You mentioned a rejection of the political elites in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. And you also mentioned a rejection of globalization generally in pursuit of the economic benefits that were seen to be associated with the less globalized world of the past. If you had to choose one of these 3 that you feel was the most dominant sentiment amongst working class voters that voted to leave, which would it be?
Oh, thank you. Immigration, without a doubt. It was the most salient issue in British politics for many years at this time. That's the most important. The measure, what you've said, and I still hold to it, motivations were in part cultural. I mean, I think most economists, not all, but most economists would say immigration was a benefit to the British economy, as it's a benefit to other economy, American economy, and so on. But it's a cultural point about the changing communities and destabilizing elements. And I'm tempted to draw an American analogy here. I think in 1992, I think one of Bill Clinton's supporters said about the election, it's the economy, stupid. And I think now you'll probably say in Britain and other countries as well, it's culture, stupid. And it's interesting to compare, perhaps as a doctoral thesis to be written here, the motivations of the Brexit voters in Britain. You could compare it with the motivations of Le Pen voters in France or Trump voters in America, whether there's cultural similarity of traditional communities being left behind, communities being stabilized, and the extent to which, and I ask this question, the extent to which a key divider now is not so much traditional social class, but education, meritocracy, passing exams, and so on. I take it the question is related to the chair of this session. Is that right?
I'm sorry?
I take it the questioner is related to the chair. Is that right? No.
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 No. So I have a second question. I kind of anticipated your answer a little bit. So to follow up, you made a very good case, I think, in your book that when faced with the choice of economic benefits or a sense of retaining control of their culture, a lot of working class voters chose culture. Much the same could be said about Trump voters in the 2016 US presidential election. How can a multiracial democracy support the liberal world order with a large swath of voters who choose closed-mindedness and bigotry when faced with economic insecurity? Is the global retreat from the liberal world order a temporary phenomenon, or is this the new normal we should expect?
Oh, this is a very profound question, which require another lecture or two to answer. The attitudes to immigration, as I say, have altered in Britain because it's now under control. People are not illiberal, but they feel a sense that things were out of their control, were not properly managed. You're absolutely right in your point that the economic argument was won by the Remainers. People agreed that it was economically advantageous for Britain to stay in the European Union. But they said, nevertheless, we want to leave. And if I may point out, there's a similar argument going on in Scotland. Nationalists agree that economically it would be better to stay in the United Kingdom, but they say culture, identity is more important. And you raise a very important question. I think the first thing I would say to it is that it's a mistake, if I may say so politely to you, not to talk about these people as bigoted, or to talk as Hillary Clinton did of deplorables. You know, these are people who have a lot of difficulties in life, and they've not had the benefit on the whole of higher education, many of them proportionately as those who welcome globalization, and they do face very serious problems. And I think anyone who's going to keep globalization going and internationalism, well, I agree with you about that, has to respect those views and take account of them. As I think the Brexiteers have done in Britain. As I said at the beginning of my talk, Brexit has headed off populism and bigotry and racism because people feel their views are being taken account of. If you call people deplorables, they feel they're not noticed, they're not being taken account of. So they will go to populists who do take account of them. And I say there's a huge division in this regard. When I was at Yale, I didn't find anyone, I think, who voted or would support President Trump, who was then president. But 70 million people did vote for President Trump. Now, similarly, if you live in London, where I do, you found hardly anyone, certainly not at smart dinner parties, who would support Brexit. But as soon as you went into the countryside, you found overwhelming support for Brexit, and particularly in the more working class areas of the country. And it's a profound division which needs to be bridged before we can say that internationalism and globalization is secure. But as I say, you ask a very powerful question. There's a good thesis to be written in answer to that, I think. It's a very powerful question indeed.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. So we have on the list we have Susan and then Mette. So if you could unmute yourself and ask the questions, please. Thank you.
How do you think COVID-19 has affected perceptions of Brexit, and what effect did Brexit have?
How do I think what is, sorry?
COVID.
COVID, yes. Well, it's moved it from the front of the agenda. It probably would have been moved anyway, because the main motivation, it's been shown in the December 2019 election, which gave Boris Johnson a majority, was simply get Brexit done. Whatever side of the debate people were on, they wanted it finished. They wanted it done, out of the way. And COVID has obviously pushed it out of the way. But as I said a few moments ago, it's led in, I think, most democracies to increased intervention by governments. And I think I suspect the ideology which has most suffered from it is neoliberalism or market liberalism of perhaps the Ronald Reagan type, Margaret Thatcher type. And of course, most of the populist parties are themselves interventionist parties. They tend not to be neoliberal parties. So that would be my answer. And COVID has also, in Britain at any rate, and I suspect the same is true of America, it's been shown to be more dangerous to people on low incomes and to people in minority groups, ethnic minority groups. And therefore it's cast more attention on the inequalities existing in society and put another nail in the coffin of those people who said that wealth will trickle down. And this, in theory, should help parties of the left. I'm careful about saying that because I took the view that the 2008 credit crunch would help parts of the left. It didn't. It helped populist and nationalist parties, which were interventionist. But I think it's encouraged the view that government has to intervene and do more for people whose life chances have not been very successful. As I say, COVID had a much greater effect on those groups.
Thank you. So we have Mette, then Rifat and Daniel. So Mette, if you can unmute yourself, please, and ask the question.
Yes, thank you for being here, Professor. So my question is that, given that Britain needs to become more competitive to have economic success outside the EU, and therefore might need to cut like public expenses, do you think that there'll be a backlash or some political consequences that we'll be able to see in the coming years?
Yeah, look, this is the key question. Of course, you're absolutely right. The aim of what you might call the foot soldiers of Brexit, the voters in the more working class areas, was they, as a previous questioner put it, with the same name as the chair, a previous questioner put it, they wanted protection against globalization. The aim of many of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, who tend to be neoliberals from the conservative right, was to put Britain free on the world stage, to become a free trading Thatcherite country, if you like. The image of Singapore, though Singapore is very authoritarian, but perhaps you see what I'm getting at. And those policies, you're absolutely right, mean cutting public expenditure, deregulating, and so on, which means a smaller state. Now that is not, as I say, is not going to prove possible with Brexit. In my opinion, my personal opinion, sorry, not going to be possible with COVID. In my personal opinion, Thatcherism or neoliberalism is the only way that Brexit can possibly succeed. One of the reasons I was against it. But I can't see it working in any other way. It needs lower taxation, lower personal taxation, lower corporate taxation. The Conservative government of all things, will probably have to raise taxation to pay for the public expenditure. Many people have been furloughed to prevent unemployment. Also, huge amounts of money have been shoved in. The nearest equivalent, I think, is Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, from what's happening in Britain. And of course, Joe Biden has pumped in huge sums of money in America, as we know, trillions, I think nearly $2 trillion. This goes all against the needs of Brexit. So you ask a very powerful question, and we are in difficulties. The only good thing for the government is the economic problems of Brexit can all be attributed to COVID, so the government may not suffer too much. But I think, this is my personal view, I think we're in great difficulties economically outside the European Union.
So we are soon, running out of time. So I may ask, I may collect questions and ask then, Professor Bogdanor to take one or two, or depending on how much time we can still have together. So so we have on the list Rifat, Daniel, an anonymous attendee, and Eileen. So if you could, in this order, unmute yourself and ask the questions.
Thank you for your talk, Professor. The UK has far outpaced the EU in its COVID vaccination rate. And seeing as how the EU has, been beset by mishaps and fumbles in its vaccine response, it looks like AstraZeneca will no longer be administered, for example. Could this positive result for the UK vindicate the Brexiteers and demonstrate state capacity, at a time when it's needed most?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's fair to say that the pessimistic prognostications made by those who oppose Brexit, and that includes myself, have so far not turned out to be right. People said there'd be an emergency budget and immediate depression and so on. That hasn't happened. Now, you're right about the EU. This has given a boost to the Brexiteers. The EU, in my opinion, makes a mistake in taking over health competencies. It's not very good at delivery, because it's even worse than the United States in terms of the number of veto points in its system. It's not a speedy deliverer. And its role should be, in my opinion, that of a standard setter. I think Anu Bradford said that in a recent book, leaving it to the member states to deliver. Just as in Germany and possibly in America, the federal government is as much a standard setter as a deliverer. And the EU has done it very badly. And it shows, I think it illustrates my point, that you have someone in a key position, Ursula von der Leyen, who wasn't even a candidate, wasn't known to people in the European Parliament elections, has a key position and cannot be removed by a parliamentary vote of confidence. And this shows what happens when leaders are not subject to popular and parliamentary scrutiny. It illustrates very well, I think, my point. And as you say, it gives Brexiteers great courage to say that Britain can go ahead and will be just as efficient, if not more efficient, than the European Union.
Daniel, so we may collect a few questions. So Daniel, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for the great lecture. In chapter 3 of your book, Britain and Europe in a Troubled World, you briefly touch on Nigel Farage's impressive media campaign. What made him such an effective communicator?
Sorry, what
made him such an effective communicator?
Oh, I think it's a good question. His sense of optimism. This is what makes Boris Johnson an effective communicator. And in America, in the past, Ronald Reagan. Carter in the 1970s said America was in the midst of a national malaise. And Reagan said people don't want to hear all the time about things wrong with their country. They don't believe that everything is wrong with their country. They want to hear what a great country it is. And Farage, and part of the Brexit case was that Britain was a great country and can prosper on its own. And that was an optimistic slant. And I think voters would generally prefer someone who's optimistic than someone who says how awful things are.
Thank you. So we have an anonymous attendee. If you could unmute yourself and ask the questions. Then we have Eileen and Noah for the final question, and then I may add my own question at the end if we have time. All right. Anonymous attendee.
Pardon, they won't be able to ask the question
okay.
Because they are anonymous. So.
Oh, I see. So I will. So can Eileen, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for being here, Professor. I was wondering how might Brexit affect Europe's refugee policies, especially in relation to the Dublin regulation? Do you expect Britain to explore opportunities to reach a new agreement with the EU, or is it more likely for bilateral negotiations to take place?
I suspect bilateral negotiations. I think Britain may be very careful about accepting many refugees because our main problem, which we'll take on, is taking people from Hong Kong there'll be a large exodus from Hong Kong because of the activities of the Chinese government there and the really ending of democracy there. And we have promised we'll take anyone from Hong Kong who wants to come, which I think involves some million people, so more rather. And so I think that will be the main area that we will concentrate on.
Noah, and then Zach Jones, the last question.
Yeah, so earlier, Professor, you were talking about how the EU could potentially shift from a technocratic body to a more political body. My question for you is, if that shift does happen, how will that change the EU's perception of its own purpose? Are there certain goals or areas of policy that a technocratic EU would prioritize that a political EU wouldn't, or potentially vice versa?
Well, I think it would abandon the idea of ever closer union, except for perhaps a small group of nations that wanted to pursue that end. And it would abandon the idea of taking ever more competencies, particularly in the central area of economic policy, because if you take those areas of policy over, what is left for national electorates to decide in national elections? If you take over tax policy, for example, budgetary policy, fiscal policy, there's not much of importance left for national electorates. And it would then become a body predominantly concerned with the rule of law and human rights. And I wish it had a stronger emphasis on that in relation in particular to Hungary and Poland. But it would be over and above national member states, because it would take a European perspective, and the countries wouldn't look at things just from their own national points of view, from a European point of view. And I said in my book, if that perspective had been there, we wouldn't have had the war in 1914, in my opinion, the First World War. So it would be a more modest body in a way, perhaps more limited objectives, but could fulfill those objectives more efficiently. At the moment, it has very wide and large objectives, which it doesn't fulfill very efficiently, in my opinion.
Zach, I don't know if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, Professor. I just wanted to follow up on these questions about, so-called deplorables and immigration and culture, as you put it, which strikes me as somewhat vague. So I was wondering if you could talk about example of control over immigration or example of control over legislation that you think, marks an important motivator for the leave decision.
So I don't quite know what you're getting at.
Well, you say migration, but what are we talking about? Are we talking about that Britain would like to cut the number of refugees?
Oh, I see. No, sorry, I see your point. No, it was free movement, that there was no restriction on the number of people from the European Union who could come to Britain. And it was thought when the new member states entered after the fall of communism in 2004, that they would be very limited. In fact, I think about 2 or 3 million net. And unlike people from the former British Empire, from the Commonwealth, they were not English-speaking people. So there was more dislocation that was felt. And it was felt it would not ever end. It's very interesting that 1/3 of members of British ethnic minorities voted to leave the European Union. And for example, Asians said, my aunt from Kolkata has to fill in all sorts of forms to come to Britain, but she's an English speaker and we're part of the Commonwealth, whereas someone from Poland with no connection with Britain, who doesn't speak English, comes in without any forms at all. So it was felt quite widely. And the aim, as I said, and tried to show, was not to end immigration, or even necessarily reduce it very much, but to ensure that it was under control. And as I said, the polls show we are more sympathetic to immigration now than any other country in the European Union. And I think there's been a startling turnaround. Immigration is no longer a salient issue. About 1 or 2% think it's the most important issue, whereas during the period before the Brexit referendum, it was seen as the most salient issue by large numbers of voters. You can find the details of this on the website of the Migration Observatory organization, which is situated in Oxford. They have factual details and also opinion surveys on that issue. It was by far the most important issue, as I've said before, in Brexit, because it made all the theoretical points about the EU salient. When people talked about sovereignty, a lot of voters didn't know what that meant, what that was about. It was something very general and vague about not making your own laws. But immigration made it absolutely salient and concrete. This is what happens when we're in Europe, and we can never limit it. And it's fair to say also that there was deceit on both sides of the referendum, as perhaps there always is in any election, but the worst deceit on the side of the Brexiteers was that Turkey was going to join the European Union, that Britain would have no veto on Turkey's entry, neither of which were true, and therefore 80 million Turks could come to Britain. And Nigel Farage used that trope, as it were. It was all completely untrue. It's fair to say there were equal elements of deceit on the other side, that referendum campaigns and election campaigns are not, perhaps unfortunately, academic seminars in which people are on oath to try and tell the truth. So immigration was a very, very salient issue.
Thank you. So if I may just then ask, the final question for today, which is, you started the talk with a discussion of Brexit as a process, and you alluded to the fact that the Labour Party may want to renegotiate parts of the current agreement. So I wanted to ask you if you could, develop this idea a little bit more, but tell us also, why would the European Union at all want to negotiate and to renegotiate this issue with Britain?
Yes. The Labour leadership, the new one in particular, under Keir Starmer, is pro-European, more pro-European than Jeremy Corbyn was. He pretended to be pro-European. I'm not sure he was. But anyway, Keir Starmer's pro-European, and many in the leadership of the Labour Party are. Their problem is that their working class supporters are not. And the Labour Party faces a deep cultural division between the metropolitan liberals based in London and the many of their grassroots supporters based in the more working class areas. And the metropolitan liberals are in danger of losing that support. And Boris Johnson won in the election, many in the so-called red wall of Labour voters in the north of England. And for those who are fascinated by this, there's a very important by-election shortly in Hartlepool, which is a strong working class area in Britain, a seat which was held for many years by Peter Mandelson, who was very close to Tony Blair, has always been Labour. But there's now some talk, even in a by-election, of it swinging to the Conservatives because of opposition to the broadly metropolitan liberal stance of the Labour leadership. But if the Labour leadership had a free hand, they would like Britain, I think, to be in the customs union, possibly in the internal market, which would limit our freedom of action, but in their view would get us great advantages. Now, the EU would also like that, I think. They'd like us to have a closer relationship, like perhaps Norway, which is in the internal market, or Turkey, which is in the customs union, and therefore they'd be happy to negotiate that. But in any case, they have to, because the agreement is up for review in 5 years, and as I said, can be ended by either party with a year's notice. It's not a final settlement. Perhaps there can never be a final settlement with the EU. I don't know, with the country so close to it. For the time being, I can't see a closer relationship happening, but anything could change. It's really impossible to predict. But I think I'm safe in predicting that the European issue will remain in British politics for many years to come. As I said, it's deeply affecting our constitution. And exposure to a different system of protection of rights and a constitution, I think will have deep effects on Britain, power of a judicial review, and of course the cohesion of the whole kingdom. It cuts right across the whole of British politics. It'd be interesting to do a kind of political science fiction account of what British politics would be like without the European issue, if it had never come up at all, how very different it would be.
Yeah. So on this note, we just want to thank, in the name of everyone here who is not, who doesn't have the right to unmute themselves.
Any more questions? If the people email me, I'm happy to answer them.
I will make this announcement to the students. This is very kind and generous. So we want to thank you for taking the time and being here with us. It has been a great honor. And we hope you come back when travel will permit. To give the follow-up on this lecture, because this, as you said, this is a never-ending subject. So with that, yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the participants for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.